Jake Harrison stood in the cold metal corridor of the Federation headquarters on Kepler Prime and watched alien beings walk past him like he did not exist. For 15 years he had served the Galactic Federation, and for 15 years he had proven that humans could follow rules and work with other species without causing trouble. The tall blue Zenthari, with their big heads full of telepathic power, looked down at him when they passed. The metal-skinned Vex made clicking sounds that Jake knew meant they found humans amusing in a sad way. He had learned to ignore these things, because he believed it was the price humans had to pay to be part of something bigger than Earth. Commander Jake Harrison wore the gray uniform of the Federation military with pride, even though the rank meant less when you were human. He had worked twice as hard as any alien to get where he was, and even now he was not allowed to command ships with mixed crews or access the best weapons the Federation had to offer. Every month he sat in a white room while a Vex doctor scanned his brain and asked him questions about his emotions and whether he felt angry or violent. Jake always gave the right answers because he wanted to prove that humans were not the wild animals that most aliens thought they were. The morning started like any other morning until Jake received the message that would change everything. He was sitting in his small office, reading reports about human colonies, when his personal communication device beeped with an urgent signal from New Terra. Jake opened the message and felt something cold spread through his chest as he read the words. His sister Lisa was dead. The message was short and came from the colonial medical officer who explained that Lisa had died from Kepler fever, a disease that was easy to cure if you had access to Federation medical technology. Jake stared at the message for a long time, before the anger started to build in his stomach like a fire that wanted to burn everything around it. He knew that Federation medical technology existed because he had seen it used on alien species many times. The nanobots that could fix any disease or injury were standard equipment on all Federation worlds except the human colonies. When humans got sick, they had to use old Earth medicine that sometimes worked and sometimes did not. Jake had never questioned this before because he was told that humans needed to prove they were responsible enough to handle advanced technology. Lisa had been 26 years old and worked as a teacher on New Terra, where she helped human children learn about their place in the galaxy. She had written to Jake just last week, telling him about her students and how excited they were to learn about the different alien species. Now she was dead because the Federation decided that human lives were worth less than alien lives. Jake walked through the headquarters building toward the council chambers where the most important decisions about the galaxy were made. His footsteps echoed in the empty hallways, and he felt something changing inside him that he had never felt before. For 15 years he had swallowed his pride and accepted that humans were treated differently because he believed it was temporary. He thought that if humans proved they could be good citizens, then eventually they would be treated as equals. Now he understood that the Federation never planned to treat humans as equals. The council chamber was a huge room with seats arranged in a circle so that representatives from different species could see each other when they talked. Jake had been in this room many times, but never to speak to the full council. Today he had requested an emergency audience, and the council had agreed to see him because they were curious about what the human commander wanted to say. Zef-Ka was the leader of the Zenthari Council and the most powerful being in the Federation. His blue skin seemed to glow with telepathic energy, and his large black eyes could look into the minds of most species. When Jake entered the chamber, Zef-Ka was already reading his thoughts, and Jake could feel the alien's mind pushing against his own like cold fingers trying to get inside his head. Jake stood in the center of the chamber and looked around at the dozens of alien beings who controlled the fate of billions of creatures across the galaxy. He had prepared a speech about equality and justice, but when he opened his mouth, the words that came out were different than what he had planned. He told them about Lisa and about all the humans who had died because they were denied medical technology. He asked them why human children had to suffer and die when the cure for their diseases sat in Federation warehouses. Zef-Ka listened to Jake's words and then spoke in the telepathic voice that all beings in the chamber could hear inside their heads. The Zenthari leader explained that humans were emotional creatures who could not be trusted with dangerous technology. He said that humans had a history of violence and war that made them unsuitable for full Federation membership. He told Jake that humans needed another 100 years of behavioral modification before they could be considered for equal treatment. Jake felt the anger in his stomach grow bigger and hotter as he listened to Zefka's words. The alien was telling him that his sister died because humans were not good enough to deserve life-saving medicine. Jake had spent 15 years proving that humans could be peaceful and civilized, and it meant nothing to these creatures who saw his entire species as dangerous animals that needed to be controlled. When Jake left the council chamber that day, he was no longer the same man who had entered it. Something was different about Jake Harrison, and everyone around him could feel it even if they could not name what had changed. Lieutenant Amy Brooks had worked with Jake for 3 years, and she knew his habits better than anyone else in the Federation military. She knew that Jake always arrived at his office exactly 15 minutes before his shift began, and that he drank his morning coffee while reading the daily intelligence reports. She knew that he spoke softly during meetings and never interrupted other people even when they said stupid things. She knew that Jake moved carefully and deliberately, like someone who was always thinking about how his actions might be seen by others. But the Jake Harrison who came to work the day after his meeting with the council was not the same man she had known for 3 years. This Jake arrived early but did not drink his coffee and did not read the reports. Instead, he sat very still at his desk and stared at nothing while his hands rested flat on the surface in front of him. When Amy spoke, to him he turned his head to look at her, and she saw something in his eyes that made her take a step backward without meaning to. His eyes looked like they belonged to a different person, or maybe like they belonged to the same person who had been hiding behind a mask for a very long time. The first sign that something had changed came during the morning briefing when Commander Vex 7 was explaining new restrictions on human personnel. The metal-skinned alien spoke in its clicking mechanical voice about how humans would now need permission from 2 alien supervisors before they could access any Federation databases. Jake listened to this announcement and then asked a question that made everyone in the room go quiet. He wanted to know why aliens were allowed to access human databases without permission, while humans needed approval to access information about their own colonies. Vex 7 made the sound that meant it was annoyed and explained that humans had proven they could not handle sensitive information responsibly. Jake nodded slowly and asked another question. He wanted to know what humans had done that was so irresponsible compared to the Zenthari who had started 3 wars in the last century, or the Vex who had accidentally destroyed an entire star system while testing new weapons. The room became very quiet, and Amy could see other human personnel looking at Jake with expressions of shock and fear. After the briefing, Amy followed Jake to his office and closed the door behind her. She asked him what he was doing because the questions he had asked could get him in serious trouble with Federation command. Jake looked at her for a long moment and then said something that made her blood feel cold in her veins. He told her that he was done being afraid of getting in trouble for asking reasonable questions. He said that he had spent 15 years being the perfect human soldier, and his sister was still dead because the Federation thought human lives did not matter. Amy had heard about Lisa's death through the informal network that connected human personnel across the Federation. She knew that Jake was hurting, but she also knew that showing anger or resentment was dangerous for humans who wanted to keep their positions. She tried to tell Jake that he needed to be careful because the Federation was always watching for signs that humans were becoming unstable. Jake listened to her words and then said something that made her realize how much he had changed. He told her that maybe it was time for humans to stop pretending to be stable when the galaxy around them was completely insane. Over the next few days, Amy watched Jake transform into someone she did not recognize. He moved differently now, with a kind of fluid precision that reminded her of the combat drills they had learned in training but had never been allowed to use. When he walked through the corridors, other people got out of his way without realizing why they were doing it. During meetings, he sat perfectly still and watched the other attendees with an intensity that made even the telepathic Zenthari uncomfortable. Amy noticed that Jake had stopped taking his daily vitamin supplements that all human Federation personnel were required to consume for their health. The change became more obvious when Clix 9, the Vex administrator in charge of human affairs, decided that Jake needed what the aliens called recalibration. Amy was in Jake's office when Clix 9 arrived with orders that Jake would be leading a mission to investigate a derelict spacecraft in the Void Sector. Everyone knew that the Void Sector was where ships went to disappear, because the space there was full of dangerous anomalies that could tear apart even the strongest Federation vessels. The last 3 missions to that area had never returned, and their fate remained unknown. Amy expected Jake to protest the assignment or ask for additional resources, or at least request permission to select his own team members. Instead, Jake read the orders carefully and told Clix 9 that he would depart within 48 hours. The Vex administrator made clicking sounds of satisfaction and left the office while Amy stared at Jake in disbelief. She asked him why he had accepted what was clearly a suicide mission, and Jake gave her an answer that made her understand that the man she had known for 3 years was gone forever. Jake told her that he was tired of pretending that suicide missions were anything other than murder attempts dressed up as military assignments. He said that the Federation had been sending humans on impossible missions for decades and calling it training or exploration when everyone knew it was really a way to get rid of humans who asked too many questions or showed too much independence. He said that this time would be different because he was not going to follow Federation protocols that were designed to get him killed. Amy spent the next day watching Jake prepare for the mission, and everything he did seemed wrong, according to everything she had learned about proper Federation procedures. Instead of requisitioning standard equipment, Jake selected weapons and tools that were not approved for human use. Instead of accepting the team members that had been assigned to him, Jake requested specific individuals, including a Zenthari telepathic specialist named Thekne, who had a reputation for arrogance and cruelty toward humans. When Amy asked Jake why he wanted to work with aliens who hated humans, he smiled in a way that made her feel scared and excited at the same time. He told her that he wanted to show these aliens something they had never seen before, and that the mission to the Void Sector was going to teach the Federation why their ancestors had been afraid of humans. Amy did not understand what he meant, but she knew that Jake Harrison was no longer the careful, obedient soldier who had spent 15 years proving that humans could follow orders and stay out of trouble. The night before the mission, Jake gave Amy a sealed message and told her to open it only if he did not return within 30 days. The derelict ship floated in the Void Sector like a dead metal beast that had been waiting in the darkness for someone to find it. Jake Harrison stood on the bridge of his Federation scout vessel and looked at the massive structure through the view screen while his team prepared for boarding. The ship was bigger than anything in the current Federation fleet, and its design was strange with curves and angles that seemed to follow patterns that no modern species would use. Thekne, the Zenthari telepathic specialist, stood beside Jake and projected thoughts of superiority and contempt that Jake could feel like cold needles in his mind. The boarding team consisted of Jake, Thekne, and 2 Vex engineers named Plix 4. And Quinn 2, who clicked and buzzed at each other in their mechanical language. Federation protocol required that Jake follow the telepathic specialist's guidance during exploration of unknown vessels because Zenthari mental abilities were considered superior to human intuition. Jake listened to the protocol briefing and nodded at the right times, but inside his mind he was planning to do something very different from what the Federation expected. When they entered the derelict ship through an airlock that opened too easily, Jake felt something change in the air around them. The artificial gravity was still working, and the corridors were filled with a dim red light that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. Thekne immediately began scanning with his telepathic abilities. and announced that the ship was empty of living minds, but filled with automated systems that were still functioning after an unknown number of years in space. The first sign of danger came when they reached a junction where 4 corridors met in a circular chamber. Sensors detected movement in the walls and ceiling, and suddenly the chamber filled with mechanical guardians that moved faster than anything the Federation had ever encountered. The guardians looked like metal spiders with multiple arms that ended in weapons designed to cut through armor and flesh. Plix 4 and Quinn 2 died within seconds as energy beams tore through their metal bodies and left smoking holes where their central processors had been. Thecne screamed in the telepathic voice that all species could hear and tried to use his mental powers to confuse the Guardians. The machines ignored his telepathic attacks and moved toward the surviving team members with mechanical precision. Federation protocol in this situation was clear and simple. Jake should have grabbed Thecne and retreated to the scout ship while calling for backup and additional resources. Instead, Jake did something that made the Zenthari's telepathic scream turn into a gasp of disbelief. Jake moved like liquid death through the chamber and dismantled the mechanical guardians with his bare hands. His body flowed around their attacks in ways that seemed to violate the laws of physics, and his hands struck their armored bodies with force that shattered metal and destroyed circuitry. Within 30 seconds, all 6 guardians were destroyed, and their broken parts lay scattered across the chamber floor. Jake stood in the center of the destruction and looked at Thecne with eyes that held no trace of the careful, obedient human the Zenthari had known before. Thecne tried to read Jake's mind to understand what had happened, but when his telepathic abilities touched Jake's thoughts, he felt something that made him stagger backward in fear. Jake's mind was not the simple, chaotic mess that Zenthari expected from human brains. Instead, it was like touching the surface of a star that burned with focused intensity and purpose. When Thecne tried to push deeper into Jake's thoughts, the mental contact caused him physical pain, and he quickly withdrew his telepathic probe. They moved deeper into the derelict ship and encountered more guardians and security systems that should have killed them both. Each time, Jake responded with movements and tactics that seemed impossible for any known species. He moved through laser grids without touching the beams and disabled force fields by manipulating their power sources in ways that violated everything the Federation understood about technology. When they reached secured doors, Jake opened them. By placing his hands on the control panels and somehow interfacing with alien computer systems that had been designed to resist all known forms of hacking. The ship's central computer core was located in a chamber that felt different from the rest of the vessel. The walls were covered with screens and displays that showed information in languages that predated all current galactic civilizations. Jake approached the main terminal and placed his hands on the interface while Thecne watched from a safe distance and tried to understand what was happening. Data flowed into Jake's mind through the interface, and he saw the history of the ship and the species that had built it. The vessel was a museum and archive that contained records of an ancient war that had torn apart the galaxy long before the current Federation existed. The war had been fought between 2 groups, and Jake felt his heart stop when he realized what the records were telling him. One side had been an alliance of species that were the ancestors of the current Federation races. The other side had been human, but these were not the humans that the Federation knew as primitive newcomers from Earth. These were humans who had built an empire that spanned half the galaxy and possessed technology that made current Federation science look like children's toys. The records showed battles where human ships moved through space like living creatures, and human soldiers fought with abilities that seemed magical to their enemies. They had been unstoppable and unbeatable until they chose to stop fighting. Jake read the final entries in the ship's log and learned the truth that the Federation had spent centuries hiding. The ancient humans had not been defeated in war. They had realized that their power was too great and their nature too dangerous for the galaxy to survive their expansion. So they had made a choice that no other species in galactic history had ever made. They had voluntarily scattered themselves across empty worlds and given up their technology and their memories to save the other species from total extinction. The humans that now served in the Federation as second-class citizens were the descendants of warriors who had been powerful enough to conquer everything but wise enough to choose exile instead. The Federation's treatment of humans was not based on their primitive nature, but on their terrifying potential. Every restriction and limitation had been designed to keep humans from remembering what they once were. Techne tried to use his telepathic abilities to erase Jake's memories of what he had learned, but discovered something that filled him with horror. Jake's mind was no longer accessible to telepathic manipulation. Whatever had awakened in him during their exploration of the ship had made him immune to Zenthari mental control. When Techne attempted to force his way into Jake's thoughts, the feedback was so powerful that it burned out several of his telepathic centers and left him gasping on the floor of the computer chamber. Jake helped the injured Zenthari back to their scout ship and set course for Kepler Prime, while the derelict vessel's data files copied themselves into his personal storage devices. During the journey back to Federation space, Jake sat in the pilot's chair and felt something growing inside his mind like a fire that had been waiting to burn. He was no longer Commander Jake Harrison, who followed orders and proved that humans could be trusted. He was something else now, and the Federation was going to learn what happened when you tried to chain the descendants of the galaxy's greatest warriors. When Jake Harrison returned to Kepler Prime with the derelict ship's data, the Federation Council moved faster than they had ever moved before to contain what they saw as a dangerous situation. Within hours of Jake's arrival, Admiral Helen Carter received direct orders from the Council to place Jake under immediate arrest for violations of xenobiological protocols and unauthorized access to restricted information. Helen had served the Federation for 20 years and had always followed orders even when those orders made no sense to her human mind. But something was different this time, and she found herself questioning why the Federation was so afraid of one human commander who had simply done his job. Helen requested a private meeting with Jake in her office before carrying out the arrest orders. When Jake entered the room, she immediately noticed the same changes that Amy Brooks had observed. Jake moved with a fluid confidence that seemed to fill the space around him, and when he looked at her, she felt like he could see through all the lies and compromises she had made during her career. Helen asked Jake to explain what had happened on the derelict ship, and Jake told her everything he had learned about humanity's true history. As Jake spoke, Helen felt something awakening in her own mind that had been sleeping for decades. She realized that she had never questioned why humans were required to take daily vitamin supplements or why human personnel were rotated to different positions every few years to prevent them from developing too much expertise in any one area. She had accepted these policies as reasonable precautions, but now she understood they were designed to keep humans weak and ignorant of their own capabilities. Helen made a decision that would change the galaxy forever. Instead of arresting Jake, she helped him access the Federation's communication network and broadcast the derelict ship's data files to every human colony and station across known space. The transmission went out on emergency channels that could not be blocked or filtered, and within minutes, every human in Federation territory was learning the truth about their ancestors and their potential. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. On New Terra, the colonial administrator tried to shut down the transmission, but found that the human technicians refused to obey his orders. On Kepler Station, human workers began asking why they were paid less than alien employees for doing the same jobs. In the Federation fleet, human officers started questioning orders that seemed designed to put them in unnecessary danger while keeping them away from advanced technology and important command positions. But the most significant changes happened in places where humans had been pushed to their limits by Federation policies. In the mining colonies where humans worked in dangerous conditions without proper safety equipment, workers began displaying physical abilities that let them survive accidents that should have killed them. In the research stations where human Scientists had been denied access to advanced equipment. They suddenly began solving problems using methods that seemed to come from nowhere. The Federation's carefully maintained control over human populations began to collapse as humans across the galaxy stopped taking their mandatory vitamin supplements and started remembering abilities they had never known they possessed. Emergency. Reports flooded into Federation headquarters describing human personnel who could move faster than security cameras could track, and human colonists who seemed to know things they had no way of learning through normal channels. Zefka, the Zenthari council leader, called an emergency session and demanded that Jake be brought before the full council to answer for his actions. Helen and Jake arrived at the council chambers, surrounded by Federation security forces, but when they entered the great circular room, Jake walked to the center without showing any sign of fear or submission. The assembled alien representatives looked down at him from their elevated seats and projected thoughts of anger and condemnation that filled the chamber with telepathic noise. Zefka stood from his seat and began speaking in the telepathic voice that could command the minds of most species. He accused Jake of violating Federation law and endangering galactic peace by spreading dangerous information that could destabilize the established order. He announced that Jake would be subjected to memory erasure and permanent detention to prevent him from causing further damage to interspecies relations. But when Zefka attempted to use his telepathic powers to dominate Jake's mind and force him to submit to Federation justice, something unexpected happened. Jake's mind did not just resist the telepathic attack, it absorbed the mental energy and reflected it back at the Zenthari leader with such force that Zefka collapsed from his elevated seat and crashed to the chamber floor while screaming in languages that predated galactic civilization. The other council members watched in horror as their most powerful leader writhed on the floor with smoke rising from his large cranium, where his telepathic organs had been burned out by the feedback from Jake's mind. When Zefka finally stopped screaming, he lay still on the cold metal floor, and everyone in the chamber could sense that his telepathic abilities had been permanently destroyed. Jake looked around at the assembled alien representatives and spoke in a voice that carried clearly through the chamber without any need for amplification systems. He told them that the age of human subjugation was over and that his species would no longer accept second-class treatment in the galaxy they had once ruled. He explained that humans had chosen exile over conquest once before, but that choice had been made by humans who were free to make their own decisions, not by humans who were kept ignorant and powerless by alien manipulation. The council session erupted into chaos as representatives from different species began arguing about how to respond to the human threat. Some called for military action to suppress human colonies before they could become more dangerous. Others suggested that negotiation might be possible if humans could be convinced to accept improved but still limited status within the Federation. A few representatives who had worked closely with human personnel spoke in favor of recognizing human equality and rights. While the council argued, Jake and Helen left the chamber and walked through the Federation headquarters building where word of what had happened was already spreading through informal networks. Human personnel throughout the building were beginning to move and speak differently as the mental chains that had bound them for generations started to break. Alien supervisors who had spent years treating humans with contempt now found themselves facing subordinates who looked at them with eyes that held no trace of fear or submission. Jake knew that the galaxy was about to change in ways that no one could predict or control. The data transmission had awakened something in humanity that had been sleeping for centuries, and there was no way to put that power back to sleep. But he also knew that the Federation would not give up their control without a fight, and that the real test of humanity's transformation was still to come. As Jake and Helen walked toward the shuttle bay to begin the next phase of their mission, they passed windows that showed the night sky above Kepler Prime. In the darkness between the stars, long-range sensors were detecting massive ships moving toward Federation space using technology that predated all current galactic civilizations. The signal that Jake's awakening had sent into the void was being answered, and humanity's true guardians were finally coming home. The awakening spread across the galaxy like wildfire, jumping from world to world, as humans stopped pretending to be less than they were. Jake Harrison had expected chaos and violence when his people remembered their true nature, but what happened was something far more profound and terrifying to the Federation. Humans did not rebel with weapons or declare war on their alien overseers. Instead, they simply began to exist at their full potential, and the galaxy discovered what that meant. On the industrial world of Titan 7, human engineers who had spent decades struggling with Federation technology suddenly began designing improvements that made alien scientists look like children playing with broken toys. The fusion reactors that had provided barely adequate power for the colony were rebuilt overnight into systems that could supply energy for 10 times the population. The atmospheric processors that had taken 50 years of careful maintenance to make the air breathable were modified in a single week to create weather patterns that turned the barren world into a garden. Dr. Lisa Park had been the head of xenobiology, research on Kepler Prime, but her work had always been limited by Federation restrictions that prevented humans from accessing advanced laboratory equipment. When she stopped taking her daily vitamin supplements and felt her mind clearing for the first time in decades, she realized that she could see patterns in biological data that had been invisible to her before. Within days, she was solving genetic puzzles that had stumped entire teams of alien researchers for centuries. The changes were not limited to intellectual pursuits. Human colonists on the frontier worlds began displaying physical abilities that redefined what Federation science thought was possible for organic life forms. On the mining colony of Vega Prime, workers started moving through the dangerous underground tunnels with a speed and awareness that eliminated accidents and increased productivity by 300%. The alien supervisors who had always treated human miners as expendable labor suddenly found themselves dealing with people who could work in conditions that would kill members of any other species. Captain Matt Rodriguez commanded a Federation patrol ship in the outer sectors where pirate attacks were common and backup was days away from any trouble. His ship carried a mixed crew of humans and aliens according to Federation diversity requirements, but the human crew members had always been assigned to support roles, while aliens handled navigation and weapons systems. When Rodriguez's human personnel began remembering abilities that Federation training had never taught them, the ship's combat effectiveness increased so dramatically that pirate fleets began avoiding their patrol routes entirely. The Federation Council tried to maintain control by declaring martial law in systems with large human populations, but their enforcement attempts met with results that shocked even the most paranoid alien leaders. Human Federation personnel who had spent decades following orders without question suddenly began evaluating those orders based on logic and morality rather than blind obedience. When Vex security forces attempted to arrest human colonists for refusing to submit to mental conditioning procedures, they found that their weapons and restraint systems had been mysteriously disabled by humans who seemed to understand technology better than its creators. Amy Brooks had remained on Kepler Prime to coordinate communications between the growing network of awakened humans across the galaxy. She watched the reports flowing in from hundreds of worlds and realized that what was happening was not a revolution, but an evolution. Humans were not becoming something new, but rather remembering something old that had been hidden from them for centuries. The careful mental conditioning that the Federation had used to keep humanity docile and manageable was breaking down as people rediscovered the abilities their ancestors had voluntarily suppressed. The most disturbing reports for the Federation came from their own research facilities, where human scientists were not just solving problems faster than expected, but were asking questions that revealed uncomfortable truths about alien technology and history. On the Zenthari homeworld, a human anthropologist named Dr. Kevin Stone began analyzing ancient ruins and discovered evidence that the telepathic aliens had not evolved their mental abilities naturally, but had stolen them from another species that they had driven to extinction. On the Vex manufacturing worlds, human technicians found proof that the mechanical aliens' advanced robotics were based on designs they had taken from human archives they claimed had been destroyed. The Federation's power structure began crumbling, as the fundamental lies that held their society together were exposed by humans who could suddenly see through deceptions that had worked for generations. Trade agreements that had seemed fair were revealed to systematically exploit human colonies. Military deployments that had been presented as peacekeeping missions were shown to be designed to prevent human populations from growing too large or too prosperous. Scientific exchange programs that claimed to share knowledge equally were exposed as sophisticated theft operations that gave aliens access to human innovations while providing nothing useful in return. But the most shocking discovery came when Admiral Helen Carter gained access to the Federation's classified archives and learned the real reason why humans had been scattered across the galaxy and kept ignorant of their heritage. The ancient war that Jake had learned about from the derelict ship had not ended with human exile. It had ended with a treaty that promised the other species safety as long as they kept humanity divided and powerless. The Federation had been created not to govern the galaxy, but to serve as a prison system designed to contain the one species that could threaten everyone else. As this truth spread through the human communities across the galaxy, the reaction was not anger or hatred, but something far more dangerous to the established order. Humans began to pity the aliens who had spent centuries living in fear of a species that had chosen mercy over conquest. The Federation's elaborate system of control suddenly looked pathetic rather than oppressive, and humans started treating their former overseers with the kind of patient condescension that adults show to frightened children. The final blow to Federation authority came when long-range sensors detected the massive fleet approaching from deep space. The ships were larger than anything in the current galaxy and moved using technology that seemed to bend the laws of physics. When the Federation sent diplomatic messages to the approaching vessels, the response came in ancient human languages that had not been heard for 1,000 years. Jake Harrison stood in the command center on Kepler Prime and watched the sensor displays that showed dozens of massive ships entering Federation space. Amy Brooks stood beside him and asked the question that everyone was thinking. Were the approaching humans coming as conquerors to reclaim their lost empire, or as judges to determine whether their scattered descendants had learned to balance power with wisdom? Jake looked at the displays and felt something in his mind that was not quite telepathy, but was something deeper and more fundamental than alien mental abilities. He could sense the intentions of the beings aboard those ships, and what he felt made him understand that humanity's true test was just beginning. The aliens who had kept his people in chains were about to discover what happened when you tried to control a species whose ancestors had been powerful enough to rule the galaxy but wise enough to choose a different path. The fleet that emerged from deep space was unlike anything the galaxy had seen in recorded history. 50 massive ships that seemed to be built from materials that absorbed light rather than reflecting it moved through Federation space with a grace that defied their enormous size. Each vessel was larger than the biggest Federation dreadnoughts, but they moved like living creatures dancing through the void. When the lead ship established communication with Kepler Prime, the voice that spoke was human but carried an authority that made even the most powerful alien leaders feel like children. Commander Roy Chen had been born among the stars in the fleet that carried humanity's true inheritors through the empty spaces between galaxies. His ancestors were the humans who had refused to accept exile and instead had chosen to guard the galaxy from threats that existed beyond the edge of known space. For 1,000 years, they had watched their diminished cousins serve alien masters, while waiting for the signal that would tell them it was time to return. Jake Harrison's awakening had sent that signal across the void, and now the Guardians were home. Roy's ship entered orbit around Kepler Prime, and the Federation Council found themselves facing a choice they had never wanted to make. They could attempt to fight beings whose technology was so advanced it seemed like magic, or they could try to negotiate with humans who had no reason to show mercy to the species that had enslaved their people. The council chambers filled with representatives from across the galaxy as alien leaders argued about how to respond to the human threat that had finally become real. Jake Harrison and Amy Brooks were transported to Roy's flagship in a shuttle that passed through the ship's hull like it was made of water rather than metal. The interior of the vessel was beautiful in ways that human minds could appreciate, but alien perception could not fully process. The corridors flowed like rivers of light, and the walls showed views of space that seemed more real than looking through actual windows. Jake felt his awakened abilities responding to the ship's systems, like instruments tuning to the same frequency. When Jake met Roy Chen in the flagship's command center, he found himself looking at a man who represented what humanity could have become if they had never chosen exile. Roy was tall and moved with the fluid precision that Jake had discovered in himself, but taken to a level that seemed to exist outside normal space and time. His eyes held knowledge of wars fought against enemies that existed in dimensions the Federation could not imagine, and his presence filled the room with power that made the air itself feel alive. Roy explained to Jake that the approaching fleet had not come to conquer or destroy, but to judge whether humanity's scattered children had learned the lessons their ancestors had died to teach. The ancient humans who chose exile had done so because they understood that power without wisdom led to the destruction of everything they might have wanted to protect. The Guardians in the Void had watched the galaxy for centuries, waiting to see if their cousins would remember how to be strong without becoming monsters. The test would not be fought with weapons or decided by demonstrations of technology. Instead, Jake and the awakened humans across the galaxy would have to prove they could face their former oppressors without becoming the tyrants they had once been. Roy told Jake that the Federation's desperate attempts to maintain control would provide the perfect opportunity to show whether humanity had learned to use power responsibly. The Federation Council made their decision and chose to fight rather than negotiate. They activated emergency protocols that had been designed centuries ago specifically to deal with a human uprising. Automated systems across Federation space began targeting human populations for elimination while alien military forces prepared to destroy human colonies before their inhabitants could become more dangerous. But the Federation's weapons and strategies had been designed to fight the primitive humans. They thought they knew not the awakened beings their policies had accidentally created. Human colonists moved their families to safety before the attacks arrived, and human Federation personnel disabled alien weapon systems faster than their designers had thought possible. The Great War that alien leaders had planned lasted less than a day before they realized they were fighting beings who seemed to know their strategies before they implemented them. Jake Harrison stood on the bridge of Roy's flagship and watched the galaxy transform as humans across known space demonstrated the balance between power and mercy that their ancestors had died to achieve. Instead of crushing their former oppressors, humans offered them something no species in galactic history had ever experienced. They offered forgiveness to beings who had spent centuries trying to destroy them. The new galactic government that emerged from the Federation's collapse was unlike anything that had existed before. Humans took their place as the protectors and mediators they were meant to be, while allowing other species to govern themselves without interference. The advanced technology that had been hoarded by alien elites was shared freely with all civilizations, while the dangerous weapons that had threatened galactic peace were quietly removed from existence. Amy Brooks became the human ambassador to the reformed Galactic Council and spent her days working with alien representatives who were still learning to see humans as equals rather than threats. She often thought about the frightened commanders and politicians who had tried so hard to keep humanity weak and wondered if they understood that their oppression had accidentally created exactly the outcome they had feared most. Roy Chen's fleet remained in Federation space, but not as conquerors or occupiers. They served as teachers who helped their awakened cousins remember abilities that had been hidden for generations while preparing for the greater threats that still existed beyond the edge of known space. The galaxy was vast and full of dangers that required humanity's full strength to face, and the time of hiding and weakness was finally over. Jake Harrison became the leader of humanity's renaissance and the symbol of what his species could accomplish when they stopped apologizing for their nature and started embracing their potential. He established academies where human children learned about their true heritage, while alien students discovered that the species they had been taught to fear were actually the galaxy's greatest hope for peace and prosperity. But Jake never forgot the lesson that had started his transformation. On the anniversary of his sister Lisa's death, he stood in the memorial garden on New Terra, where her name was carved alongside thousands of other humans who had died because the Federation valued alien comfort over human lives. Amy stood beside him and asked if he regretted the choice to forgive rather than punish the beings who had caused so much suffering. Jake looked at the stars that filled the night sky above New Terra and thought about the ancient humans who had chosen exile over conquest, and the guardians who had spent centuries protecting a galaxy that had tried to destroy their people. He thought about the balance between power and wisdom that defined what it meant to be human and the responsibility that came with abilities that could reshape entire civilizations. His answer captured the essence of humanity's transformation and the promise they offered to the galaxy they now protected. They had tried to make humans less than they were, but humans had chosen to become more than they had ever been, and that choice would echo across the stars for generations to come.